welcome everybody to the webinar. Today we're going to be discussing Linux as a whole and why security is complicated in how you protect Linux. And we'll be going over how Red Canary kind of addresses some of those issues and challenges that you might be facing and how to protect your Linux infrastructure. We'll be kind of diving in deep in a deeper conversation with some of our Linux experts here at Red Canary to get some of their perspectives. To start, let's go over a couple of housekeeping things. Yes, this webinar is being recorded. We'll make sure to send out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar recording and slides to everyone attending and everyone who signed up. Let me introduce you guys real quick to some of the people that you are going to be hearing from today. So my name is Kevin G. I'm a senior product marketing manager here at Red Canary. I'm specifically focused on a lot of our technical feature releases, and I also help support our channel and marketing, our channel and partner team with some marketing material and content, stuff like that. I'm joined here today by Dave Bogle, our senior threat researcher here at Red Canary. Dave, go ahead and just kind of cover some of what your role here is.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, my name is Dave Bogle, as Kevin mentioned, and here at Red Canary, I'm responsible for researching and understanding the Linux threats, how we might detect them. I work closely with our detection engineers, with our Intel team. I work closely with the engineers for the Linux EDR product in trying to analyze and improve our detection capabilities, specifically for Linux threats. I also spend a fair bit of my time trying to research new potential data sources that we can look at so that we can detect novel threats that we haven't seen in the wild yet, and also expand our detection coverage on the threats that we are detecting.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. And then I'm also joined by Thomas Gardner, one of our senior detection engineers here at Red Canary. So Thomas, go ahead and introduce yourself and your role.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so I'm a senior detection engineer. So my team researches adversary behavior, builds detection logic to identify that behavior, and triages the output to kind of figure out if the logic's effective and how well it works in terms of like detecting malicious behavior in our customer environments. I'm also responsible for kind of alerting customers when we see that malicious behavior in their environments.
Very cool. Should be a good conversation, but before we dive into that, let me just cover a quick agenda real quick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a very brief high-level overview of what Linux is, some of the challenges that it faces, some of the things that we've heard from customers directly and prospects when we were building out our solution, and then kind of cover real quick our approach to how we face those challenges. Then we'll kind of back it up again and dive into the deeper conversation with Thomas and Dave. We'll end with a very quick threat investigation demo to kind of showcase what it looks like when one of these guys is doing an investigation on something that we see. And then we'll open it up to Q&A at the end if we have enough time and you guys have other questions. One other person I forgot to introduce, we do have a guest moderator here, Ali Barnes. She's our product manager in charge of the Linux EDR solution. So she's just going to be kind of lurking in the background, and hopefully if you guys have questions specifically about the product itself, she'll be able to jump in during the Q&A as well. So let's dive right in so we can get into the conversation. So what is Linux? Well, it is an open source operating system, very similar to a Windows or Mac operating system. It can be installed on your endpoint workstation or installed in a server. The fact that it is open source does mean that there are a couple of unique things about it compared to its Windows or Mac counterparts. First of all, it is designed to be flexible and customizable, meaning you can use it as the entire operating system itself, or you could take out the pieces that you need and make it a little bit more modular and precise to what you are trying to accomplish. So you could only choose to run specific services if you're trying to do something like containers or like a file sharing server or the whole thing. Because it's open source, it also means that it's not standardized, meaning there's no, one publisher like a Microsoft or Apple behind it that's publishing one specific version out there. Because of its open source nature, it does mean that there are going to be a lot of different distributions and versions out there, including the ability for people to kind of download the code themselves and create their own sort of version. There are some common versions out there like Red Hat and CentOS, at enterprise level, and Ubuntu on the more consumer-based level that exists. So why does any of that matter? Why does Linux matter? Why are we having this webinar to begin with? Well, as we've kind of seen, especially over the past couple of years, Linux is widely used, especially within the cloud computing and like SaaS space. A couple of stats here at the bottom. Amazon's EC2 cloud computing runs on 94%, is running on Linux, where Azure cloud is about 60%. And Gartner has also kind of noted this growth, mentioning that Linux server growth has consistently outperformed Windows server growth. So part of the things that we mentioned on the previous slide, where it's so open source and modular, probably makes it so widely appealing to be used, right? You could kind of customize it. So I don't think that we're going to see any kind of slowdown, and we expect Linux to continue to be used more and more. But one of the challenges, and we'll start diving into that, is that the technology that exists, or at least what we've seen within the security industry, is that it's not really well developed to address some of the challenges that Linux faces. So what are some of those issues? What are some of those complications? Well, as we mentioned, it's not standardized. So there is not one single distribution or version out there, meaning that most solutions out there aren't the one size fits all, right? What might work for Red Hat might not work for CentOS or any of the other versions. So it's hard to find a solution that might encapsulate all of those different distributions of Linux that exists out there. Another issue that we see a lot with the existing solutions is that they aren't built or optimized specifically for Linux, meaning they might not be collecting or monitoring the right processes or data streams on those Linux endpoints or servers, or they might be adapted from their Mac or Windows counterparts, meaning that they're not optimized for Linux. They might be taking up more resources, hogging more memory, affecting other processes, or negatively impacting the Linux system in one way or another. And finally, while Linux itself is open source, there are also open source solutions that exist, but because of the complications of Linux, there is a lot of manual work that's required. You have to have the knowledge as well as the time and resources to collect that data, process it, analyze it yourself, and understand what you're looking at. So that brings us to some of the challenges that we've heard directly from customers, right? Maybe some of you out there on this webinar face some of these same things. You have a Linux infrastructure within your environment, and you want to protect it, but maybe you don't have enough team members or resources to use those open source solutions to monitor and protect them, to actually run those resources and analyze the data. Or maybe even if you do have enough team members and available people to do that, they might not have the necessary knowledge or expertise. And then the final biggest challenge that I think we hear the most from pretty much everyone we talk to is this sort of fear or hesitance of installing something on your Linux system that might interfere or disrupt the system itself. So from what we've gathered, for the most part, your Linux infrastructure is probably the foundation of your production system. Production environments obviously have a lot of compliance regulations that they need to adhere to. There's your change policy process that you need to adhere to, meaning that whatever you put on that system needs to be, sort of just sitting in the background, not interfering in any way, whether accidentally by taking up more resources than it needs to, or by making changes without your knowledge, right? There's very strict controls that you have around those. So you need to ensure that whatever you install there isn't going to interfere with any of that. So how did Red Canary approach some of those challenges and issues? Well, first we started by building a Linux EDR agent. we kind of understood some of those fears and hesitance of installing a third-party security software. So we wanted to make sure that the agent was lightweight and very sort of resource minimal. It's not going to take up a whole lot of resources or memory, and it's just built to sit there and silently collect telemetry data, meaning we specifically built it to not perform any actions or changes on your behalf. It's just there to kind of collect data for our MDR service to do the analysis and be able to alert you to threats, so then that way you can react and respond in the appropriate time frame and within your own sort of compliance controls and stuff like that. So once we collect that data, we send it to our MDR service. The first part of that is our advanced detection engine, which is built on a bunch of Linux threat intelligence and research performed by people like Thomas and Dave and the rest of our team in order to build out those detectors. And we'll analyze that telemetry data and try to surface any possible suspicious threats or activities. Once something is surfaced by that detection engine, it gets passed on to a real person, a detection engineer, who's going to perform a thorough, deep analysis of those threats. They're going to do all of that manual work that you might not have the time or capabilities to do to help you identify real threats and alert you to those actual risks. By doing so, we'll kind of take a lot of that manual work from you and help you kind of reduce some of that alert fatigue that you might be getting. So now that we kind of have this foundation of what Linux is and kind of some of the challenges and approach, let's go all the way back to the beginning. I'm going to welcome in Thomas and Dave here, and we'll kind of start our discussion. I'm going to try to keep this casual. I'm just going to be asking them a couple of questions and let them just kind of give you some of the technical info. So I've tried to kind of establish this baseline. I know is very quick, that Linux is quite popular today, especially within SaaS apps and cloud computing, and it seems to be widely used and continues to grow. Why do you guys think that is? What is your perspective on it? Why is Linux so popular?
Yeah, I think the first word that kind of comes to my mind for that question is flexibility. Containers are a pretty close runner-up, though. We found a lot of companies choose to run production servers like web applications, databases, network monitoring servers on top of Linux. They've done so for years already. Some have even done so with the same application for decades. I think that's because Linux doesn't really form an opinion on what you run or how you run it, really. If you need to run like a web server, a database, and like an LDAP server on the same Linux server, it allows you to do that. If you can run them on separate ones, totally fine there. If you are building a new application, you design it to use like microservices. You can do all of these things without really changing the underlying operating system, kernel updates notwithstanding or anything like that.
Yeah, and I totally agree with what Thomas said. Flexibility is definitely key for customers as they're planning out their production environments. One of the things that comes to mind is scalability. So Kevin, you had mentioned how you can kind of customize Linux to fit whatever your use case is. And one thing that we often see is, these production servers are highly optimized to do usually one or two, specific tasks, right? And so one thing that makes Linux so great is you can really get in deep to the configuration of it, right? And you can make sure to kind of strip out all the unnecessary stuff to focus on just whatever that particular server is supposed to be doing that and make sure it can do it really well.
Right. Very, very nice. Sorry, it's not going back. There we go. Sorry, I came off mute and then it skipped a couple. So I also wanted to kind of dive in and get your perspective on some of the biggest obstacles or challenges to protecting Linux. I know I kind of went over that quickly, but I'm just trying to see if you guys had any additional insight or perspectives on that.
Yeah, one of the biggest obstacles I've kind of firsthand experienced really has to do with how Linux is used in comparison to other operating systems like Windows and Macs. if all we had to do was kind of apples to apples compare Linux workstations to Windows workstations, I think protection would probably be a lot easier. But since Linux is used to run often really highly available systems, production servers, specialized systems like network or virtualization equipment, you echoed this point before, but a lot of our customers are extremely sensitive to including third-party code, especially ones which can kind of take action on a system, potentially take down production servers. We really have to take great care in what data we collect, what system resources we use, and what kind of response actions we can take during an incident. And I think maybe the best example of this is like a really common solution during like an incident or something for a compromised workstation is to just re-image the thing. End users, you know, they get a new laptop or something, maybe they're impacted, but it's not too bad. But that's not really an option for a lot of production servers, unfortunately. And that does make protection more difficult on Linux, I think.
Yeah, and I think you know, the diversity of the Linux ecosystem is certainly a challenge as well. So the fact that, you know, like you said, Kevin, there's, you know, you've got Red Hat that's supporting one kind of specific flavor. You've got Ubuntu, you know, Arch, Gentoo, OpenSUSE, like all just so many different distros. And customers we've seen will use just about all of them, right, across our customer base. And so trying to develop a product that can work across all these different platforms is tricky because, you know, having worked on the Linux EDR product, as we were trying to figure out, you know, how do we get the information that we need out of this particular system so that we can catch the threats that we're looking for, the answer is not always the same across those different distros. And we noticed that, you know, some of the code would have to be somewhat specific to say, oh, you know, for Ubuntu, we do it this way. For Red Hat, we do it slightly differently. Or if it's kernel 3.10 versus 5.4 versus whatever kernel version you happen to be on, there's certainly a great deal of challenges there as well in terms of trying to support just such a broad ecosystem.
Right. That was great. So let's kind of dive into something that I didn't really cover even at a high level. But what do you guys see as some of the biggest threats to Linux and or the most common threats? And, you know, those might be different. They might be the same.
Yeah, I think this is something Thomas and I talk about like almost on a daily basis. Is, you know, what are we seeing happening in the wild, right? Thomas being on the front lines of that. You know, it's different because, you know, the threats that we see in the Linux environments are focused on, you know, servers that are running, you know, usually headless, right? There's not necessarily an interactive user on them like you might have on a laptop or someone's desktop at home or something. And so the threats that we see are much different in terms of they're attacks that are, you know, looking for web servers, they're looking for databases, they're looking for Docker containers, they're looking for, you know, kind of these services that run in the background, as opposed to, you know, phishing threats or some of that. So a lot of the things that we'll tend to see are coin miners, web shells, you know, things that are trying to exploit databases or other services that might be running on those systems.
Yeah, I definitely, I mean, like Dave said, we talk about this almost daily, so we have very similar ideas here. Definitely the most common threat we see is crypto mining, coin miner installation. I think kind of everybody in this space is can probably agree on that just being the most common threat. What I think is interesting about those, though, is like they're a very common threat. It's very easy to kind of spray and pray on the internet. Just see what servers are open, what you can get your hands on. It doesn't really matter what kind of server or network you're on. You can install a coin miner and your objectives are there. A much bigger threat that we've seen is cases where attackers will use like production Linux servers in conjunction with attacking a wider network, like a big Windows Active Directory network. And like we'll see things like just simple web shells like Dave talked about, used as persistence, and maybe they get caught in like an Active Directory network. There's a lot of great detections for Windows in that space, but they're kind of hoping and relying on your Linux servers just not being looked at in the course of an investigation, and just using that as sort of a ticket back into a network.
Gotcha. You guys kind of mentioned it and kind of touched on it, but obviously it sounds like the attack vectors that Linux faces is a little bit different from the Windows and Mac counterparts, right? You talked about not as much phishing worries here, and more so different. So how do you think like are the threats that we see on Linux, how different are they from, a Windows server or Mac server or Mac endpoint? And how much does that change the approach to security?
Well, so because there's not really as much human interaction, there's not as much of an ability for an attacker to trick somebody to get in on the system. And we also know like a lot of production Linux servers, a lot of them in the cloud, they're internet facing, which means attackers are more likely to get in with like a publicly available exploit, something like log4j, which we all had fun with last year and early this year and still going on. It definitely changes the game in terms of like how we detect things, because we have to kind of expect a lot more system services being part of an attack and not necessarily being able to trace things back to a specific endpoint user action, which we can often do in Windows.
Yeah, and I think another thing that certainly ends up being different is when you're looking at some highly available production server that's maybe run on a web server or a database or some kind of service, right? As compared to maybe just someone who's using their laptop, like the amount of data that comes out of a production service is just many orders of magnitude higher. And so when you're trying to balance that with, we need to be lightweight, we need to not, interrupt the what the production servers are doing, but we also need to make sure that we're looking at all that telemetry so that we can effectively analyze it for threats. That's a whole nother challenge, right? And there's a lot more noise for bad actors to hide in.
Yeah, when we're wrong about our detection logic, we're wrong like 10,000 times over. We learn very quickly.
That's good, Elm. That's also kind of a good transition. So with threats being a little bit different and the way that attacks happen on Linux being different, what's unique about Red Canary's approach? So obviously there's the kind of two pieces. So let's start with the EDR agent. What's unique about our EDR agent? And as Dave was bringing up, there's lots of data. What type of data are we collecting? What are we looking at on the Linux system?
Yeah, I can talk to that. So obviously, when we were developing the Linux EDR product, we had tried to understand what our customers' needs were, right? And we knew that, some of their biggest wants for this product were they wanted to be lightweight, it needed to be resilient, right, and stable, and it needed to be unobtrusive on their system, right? So something that it could run on like a 1-core, 1 gig, virtual machine, or it could run on a 96-core, 1 terabyte machine or something like that, and everything in between, right? And so as we were developing it, we kept those principles in mind. So a lot of our design decisions focused on how can we make sure that we effectively, analyze all the telemetry and send it off to our MDR product without interfering with what the production server is doing. So we made some decisions like using Rust because that's a language known for developing lightweight and very fast code. We're leveraging eBPF so that we can do a lot of that telemetry collection in the kernel, which ends up being very fast. And tried to design it in such a way that we can access all of the different pieces of data that we might think are interesting and even add new ones. So right now, the kind of things we're looking at are, process events, right? We want to see when a process starts, when a process ends, and what was that process. We look at network information, right? So when connections are made, we want to know where those connections are going to. And then there's some more specialized ones that are trying to look at process memory, right? To scan for potential malware that's living in memory. Things like rootkits, DNS queries, interactive shell activity that might be on the system. Those are all some of the different things that we're trying to watch for, and many more, right? And the nice thing is with using something like eBPF, right? The door is wide open in terms of future telemetry that we can try and collect, and that's a lot of where some of my research is looking at what other information might be helpful to detect new threats or novel threats or a broader range of threats.
It's great. Yeah, and as we mentioned, obviously we're collecting loads and loads of data, and the agent is a large part of that. Obviously, the other part is our MDR service and the detection engine. So I want to get a sense of how do we build out the detection engine? What type of threat intelligence and research do we do behind the scenes to build out the detectors to be able to analyze all of this, data and process and memory, rootkits and stuff?
Yeah, so I can take that one. So the core of our MDR service really revolves around humans who are analyzing the events and building out detection logic accordingly. We've got quite a bit of automation kind of going on behind the scenes to reduce the workload on our people, but a lot of that automation focuses on known activities, well-known threats that we've seen thousands of times, adware, like really common malware, stuff like that, specific tool behaviors that we can kind of safely automate away from people. Think like really common kind of credential theft activity. But kind of everything else gets adjudicated by a human, by a detection engineer on my team. The really nice thing about the method that we use is we combine responsibilities to both review and detect threats in the same team, which means like we have a really big incentive to drive down false positives and to build like really highly tuned detection logic. If, like I mentioned earlier, if we make some overly broad rule, we are the ones who ultimately get hurt because we have to go triage those events. So we really try and get ahead of that kind of stuff by thoroughly researching our adversary behaviors, talking with Dave, talking with our threat intel team, stuff like that.
Great. Thomas, if you don't mind, how do you go about doing that research? How do you go about identifying new threats? Are you putting on like your white hat and throwing stuff at a system? Are you just like researching things that exist and just trying to look for the next new malicious attack? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, well, it's definitely a combination of things. Sometimes standing up a few cloud VMs or something and throwing some malicious activity at it is the way to go if we need to kind of simulate stuff. But honestly, one of the best sources of data we get is analyzing new threats that we see firsthand. In an ideal scenario, we detect each stage of an attack via multiple behaviors. But there are times when we only detect something in 1 or 2 stages or with 1 or 2 detection analytics. When we identify attacks happening and we write them up, we'll go back once they're published, once we've adequately scoped them, we'll go back, revisit the behavior we saw, and try and basically shore up our coverage. As a result, we'll build out new detection logic where appropriate. We actually have written a previous blog post about this called The Adversary's Gift. This approach works really well in our experience. When we see like adversaries react to what we detect about them, sometimes they'll try and change their tactics to avoid detection bias again. What we really see is like 1 or 2 actions that they think we are keying off of get changed in the next attempt, but if we're layering our coverage appropriately, it'll actually be really, really exceptionally difficult for an adversary to change every single detectable technique we have and still achieve their objectives. And then, of course, outside of the threats we see directly, we also have a really, really excellent threat intelligence team that we work closely with. They keep us updated on new threats that we see and watch blog posts and go back and also review our detections, trying to find patterns amongst them to try and identify new attack groups like Raspberry Robin, stuff like that. It's a really nice inter-team relationship there.
That's great. I think I just kind of want to summarize something with something that we've heard from a customer. Using a service like Red Canary or any other MDR service, you get not only just a lot of the custom threat intelligence that people like you guys put the work in, but you're also kind of gaining that experience from other customers that we might be servicing. Pretty much anything that we see across the board, whether it's affecting customer, some new attack, something that we've researched on our own, our customers benefit from that wide level of threat research thrown into not only our people but into our detection engine as well. So the next step here, so obviously our detection engine has a lot of work and research and intelligence put behind it. There's a lot that goes into it from the beginning in order for it to do what it does and analyze that data. When it surfaces something suspicious, when it says, hey, this looks like a possible threat, what does that look like from a detection engineer standpoint?
Yeah. So once some kind of detection logic is fulfilled in the engine, an event will get created, it'll get adjudicated. If there's existing automation in place to handle the event, awesome. If not, like I said, a human reviews the event. We kind of look at surrounding context. We take notes in our detection logic so that whichever detection engineer is reviewing the event has kind of the purpose for the detector, has kind of normal behavior, malicious behavior, all this great additional data that isn't necessarily present in the logic itself. And then with all of that context and additional info, we generally try and tell a story. They're not like big stories or anything, but we try and tell a story and have it make sense in terms of known malicious activity, suspicious activity, things that maybe fall in a gray area, or benign activity that we've seen. Depending on what happened, if the detection engineer has kind of figured out, okay, this is malicious or suspicious, we'll write up a little report. We'll basically give you the story that we have. For especially worrisome events, credential theft, savaging persistence, known malware, stuff like that, the detection engineer will also kind of contact a friendly face on the incident handling team about it. They'll then go ahead and reach out to the customer and work with them to remediate the threat.
Very cool. I want to make sure we're saving enough time for a Q&A. So let's kind of maybe take a look at what that sort of threat investigation looks like walking through some of the back-end things.
All right. So we have a pretty common Linux threat that we've seen. What we have is quick malicious software. Looks like a coin miner to the detection engineer who wrote this up. So what we always start off with is just like a quick summary sentence of the report that we're writing up. We try and give the facts of what happened. We have an interactive bash shell, spawning multiple commands, doing reconnaissance, downloading some binary, and the binary happens to be a known coin miner. A little bit further down, we have a little more in-depth summary of all of the detection analytics we have. So like in this case, like I was mentioning earlier, we try and catch many different things. So we'll do some things like, hey, we'll do some really obvious detection analytic for like process names matching known miners. Okay, but then we'll also have like, oh, some masquerading attempts maybe, or some additional bad behavior that we know has been associated with malicious activity, but isn't necessarily malicious, like reading bash history. that's something that like a lot of developers do legitimately. But when we combine all of these separate analytics together, we become really confident that what we're looking at is malicious or at least suspicious. So a little further down, we have ties into our intelligence team's profiles. And then we have the actual data that like our customers are going to get, which is really where our sentence summary starts. So we have interactive shell, we have our reconnaissance commands. Maybe this is a C2. Why are they pinging this? I don't know. Let's look a little bit further down. Oh, they actually are downloading a binary. And then further down, they're executing it. They're executing commands consistent with like known crypto miners, which are trying to just disable other miners so that they have more control over the system CPU. And as we go further and further down, we try and lay out that story that we built over time as we got these detection analytics coming in as a detection engineer. In this case, we wrote this up and went ahead and tried to give as much as we could in this report so that when we contact the incident handler for this customer, they can go and say, oh, they added SSH keys as persistence. Let's remove those. Let's make sure that the system is locked down from any kind of backdoors established on here. And yeah, that's about it. That's kind of the overall story that we try and tell when we get these like malicious events coming in.
Thank you, Thomas. That was awesome. So let's just kind of recap real quick, and then we'll try to dive into Q&A in case people have some questions. I saw a couple pop up during that, so we'll try to address some of them. So just kind of recapping everything that we went over in parts of our discussion. Again, Linux threats and attack vectors differ greatly from their Windows and Mac counterparts, so it does take a different sort of approach to addressing some of those issues and threats. Again, the biggest thing to take away here is Linux is often the foundation of your production system or your production environment. So any disruptions or negative impact on the system itself can negatively impact the business and affect your customers, whether that's from a third-party software that is not designed for Linux interfering with other services and processes, all the way to something that maybe it's not interfering accidentally, but it's making changes on its own. And eschewing your compliance regulations and policy processes and stuff like that. As you've seen from Thomas and Dave, we have a wealth of Linux experts who are on the front lines of Linux defense. They're constantly researching and doing, writing up information and blog posts and all this stuff on the latest threats and risks, and building out our detection engine and constantly building new detectors and making sure that we're always on top of whatever the next risk or the next threat is coming down the line. And then finally, our lightweight sensor is built and optimized for Linux to minimally to have minimal impact on the system and to take up as little resources as possible. So it's sort of like you set it up and it starts collecting data, and you could kind of leave it on its own and you don't have to worry about that at all. So before we dive into the Q&A, Alex here is popping up a quick little poll. What would you like to learn more about? If you would like to learn more about Red Canary's Linux EDR solution or to schedule a demo, go ahead and fill that information out. I'll just kind of sit here for a few seconds while you guys do that. But definitely, try to reach out if you want to learn more. Feel free to contact us, and we're more than happy to try to answer any questions, even beyond this webinar, if you just want to see it in action. It always helps. Okay, the poll will stay up while we go through the Q&A. So I'm going to kind of try to facilitate some of these questions here. We have one just fairly easy question. Hopefully you guys can answer this. How do I implement the Linux EDR agent? How do I install that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see that Ali posted a response to that, but that's definitely something that, if this is a product that you are interested in, you can get in touch, and our team will help, walk you through that process and make sure that you can get everything installed and set up working correctly. And I know that, specifically with Linux EDR, customers have a wide range of environments that they need to install in. And I think we've seen just a whole bunch of different questions that have come up on, hey, does it work on this distro or that distro or whatever it may be. And I know our team is well versed in how to, kind of walk through that process and make sure that, regardless of what your environment looks like or what distro you're running, we can get it up and running. And as Kevin had said, once it's up and running, it's pretty much just kind of running in the background. You can almost forget about it, and it should just work very seamlessly after that.
Very cool. Thank you, Dave. Earlier, Dave, you when talking about the agent, you mentioned that it supports eBPF and stuff. What's special or what's significant about adding that eBPF support for the agent versus just using audit on Linux itself to ingest that telemetry data and to look at the logs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I saw a question had also come up about, audit D as well. And so maybe this will help answer that. But there, initially when Linux EDR was developed, audit D was the first choice, just because it seemed like it fit the use case very well, given that that was its initial, purpose, right? Of audit D was supposed to just be able to, somewhat mimic event tracing for Windows, or at least a similar type of tool, but for the Linux platform. But we realized, as we were talking to different customers, that there were a few snags we ran into with that kind of pushed us towards eBPF. The biggest one being some customers were using other products that were using Audit D, and Audit D has a limitation where you can really only have one thing that owns Audit D at a time. And so if they already had something else running, then that was just kind of a no-go for them. So we quickly tried to pivot to eBPF for that reason. But then we also realized that eBPF opened the door for a lot of other types of telemetry. So with audit, it has certain hook points that it can give you information about, and you can subscribe to those. You can get that data. You can configure it however you want. But if there's something else that you need, audit isn't necessarily the most flexible tool in that sense, right? To be able to get other pieces of data that it doesn't natively support. It also can bog down the system in terms of performance. And so eBPF, from our comparisons and tests that we've run, has been much more performant than running audit. And knowing that, again, we're running in a production environment, that was a really important thing to us, is making sure that, we keep it very performant, very fast, very lightweight. And eBPF definitely fit that use case, I think, a little bit better than audit did.
Great. Yeah. I definitely think it's super useful to add that support and give us kind of a wider breadth of coverage and allow us to support a lot more moving forward with Linux. This question is a pretty interesting one, and this is more of a, I guess, opinion based question for everyone. So where do you believe the MITRE attack framework can make improvements in regards to Linux coverage? I know just across the board, Red Canary likes to talk about that we map to the MITRE framework across the board for all of our threat detection. So is there something that it's maybe lacking for its Linux coverage? Or do you think it's good?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the Linux coverage that attack already has. I think, especially with one of the more recent updates, I think it was V11 or something, that coverage expanded quite a bit. And it's really, really nice to see that attention happening. I think one of the things that I've noticed with it is certain techniques, like overarching techniques, let's say like inter-process communication. Maybe they'll have like a Windows equivalent or like a Windows implementation of it, like DCOM services, something like that. but there's no equivalent to it added in Linux. And I mean, you can get away with it with like if I'm an attacker using like dbus to issue commands to my implant or something. I'm using interprocess communication, but there's no specific sub technique of it. So it still has attack coverage. It's just not quite to the same specificity level that Windows is. I've noticed that in a few cases. I know like I said, though, it's improved quite a bit, especially in regards to like persistence techniques. I really love the expansion of the persistence techniques, like the XDG auto start entries, and like some more examples of like system D services being used. Overall, honestly, I really love attack as a thing. And I'm really looking forward to both the Linux and container techniques in particular getting more attention here in the future.
Yeah, very, very nice. Here's a sort of general question about our MDR service as a whole. So if a customer is using us with our Linux agent and our MDR service to kind of monitor their Linux infrastructure, and we do identify something malicious, do we then help provide any insight into remediation, like steps to take to respond?
So that you'll get a much better answer from like another like representative from like incident handling or something, but the incident handling team, yeah, does help customers walk through remediation steps.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of good to point out that with the MDR service and the CERT team, there's a bunch of different categories of who you're working with, right? So ahead of time, it's the detection engineers that are the ones like monitoring the system and helping you identify threats. If something is detected, we have a specific other group of people as incident handlers who will work directly with you, kind of help you respond appropriately and accordingly within a timely manner to make sure that it's remediated and try to minimize the impact on your business. But whenever you purchase, especially Red Canary's MDR service, you're getting a whole team of support people that are all segregated depending on where in that path or in that timeline you might be falling. Okay, let's see. Couple minutes left. Here's another question that we saw come in ahead of the webinar, but I think it's good to answer. How do adversaries use privilege escalation within Linux environments?
That's a good question. And I'd say the way it gets used is it varies pretty widely. Obviously, if you have a well-configured Linux system, then things naturally should just be pretty well locked down and segregated. And so it makes it pretty tricky to do anything until you get some kind of privilege escalation, right? Like it makes it hard to install things. It makes it hard to change things on the system or be able to potentially get, certain pieces of information they might want to retrieve, right? So in terms of how they use privilege escalation, I would say it tends to be one of the first steps. So Thomas had talked about we try to paint the picture of what happened from the beginning of attack, to where the detection occurred. And we want to sort of see that whole timeline. Privilege escalation, I would say usually is near the beginning of that, either via like an exploit. So, recently there was the PwnKit vulnerability that came out, I think a couple months ago. There was Dirty Pipe as well, right? That was another form of privilege escalation. Both working very differently in terms of how they were able to get elevated privileges. But once that happened, it kind of opens the door to the attacker to then be able to pivot, to be able to install persistence, to be able to install malicious software or whatever it is that their objective is. It usually starts with a privilege escalation. And so one of the key areas of some research that I've been doing is, looking into what options do we have for detecting that? How can we detect the various types of privilege escalations? Because, the more I've dug into it, the more I realize there's a lot of different ways that can happen. And so, like I've been researching, what we can do to accurately detect that and make sure that our customers know that, these are things that we can catch and we can detect. And I think right now our Linux EDR is well positioned to do that, right? And the detectors that our detection engineers have built do a great job of that as well. And we're going to continue researching that and broadening that as much as possible.
Very nice. Okay, last question that just came in. How often have we seen Linux servers affected by ransomware? Like, does that seem to be kind of a common thing that we've had to deal with?
We have fortunately not really seen that. We are aware of more public reports of that kind of activity happening, catching binaries that could potentially deploy ransomware in VirusTotal, stuff like that. But we actually haven't really seen that happen. I think part of that too is a lot of the times that like Linux focused adversaries have used ransomware or attempted to use ransomware, they've used it on some pretty specialized virtualization equipment, mostly like ESXi servers. And this kind of goes back to more what we were talking about at the beginning of the webinar. Really specialized systems like that are really sensitive to installing like a third-party agent or something like that, or even really just getting access to the underlying host sometimes can be a challenge, even for system owners. Some vendors will be very careful in what they allow you to install on their hosts, and that definitely makes those particular forms of Linux ransomware very difficult to see firsthand, at least very difficult to see before the ransomware is deployed, I should say.
I didn't even know that. I would have expected it to be a pretty high percentage of ransomware attacks on, Linux, and especially something like a production environment where, being shut down even for an hour has such negative effects. So that's pretty interesting. Yeah.
DDoS bots are pretty easy to buy too. So
okay.
If you want to take down some production servers, you can do it pretty cheap.
True. That is all the Q&A that I see so far. I think we've addressed most of them live. A couple we answered directly in there. Yeah, I think that is it. Thank you, Thomas and Dave. That was, I hope that was, beneficial to everyone on the webinar and stuff like that. I found a lot of the insights pretty engaging. I know I don't know the most about Linux, so I learned a lot just talking to you guys, prepping for the webinar and stuff. So very cool. Yeah, again, I don't see any more questions. So if anybody does have something afterwards, if they're reminded of something, if somebody watches the webinar back afterwards and wants to reach out, don't hesitate to contact Red Canary. We're always happy to answer questions, and we like to be transparent with everything. So if you have questions about how things work on the back end, or just a general support type question, we're more than willing to assist in any way.